Hi all, we're just going to give it a couple of minutes for people to be able to jump online. So just hang tight for, let's say, 120 seconds-ish.
Look at that.
All right, I reckon we might jump in. People are still streaming in, but we might get started as it's 32 past. Oh, COVID vibes. Back online. Hello, everybody. My name is Amber Waterford. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event on celebrating 10 years of the Rental Affordability Index. I want to start today's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. We're all on different land today, but we are all on country. And I want to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and acknowledge that this is unceded land. The Committee for Sydney was the team at SGS and at Shelter, National Shelter, reached out to us a little while ago asking if we'd like to partner with them on this event celebrating 10 years of the Rental Affordability Index, which we jumped at the opportunity to do. I mean, celebrate is perhaps not the right word because there's not a lot to celebrate when it comes to rental affordability, but it is a critical issue that we really wanted to put front and center in the public debate. Obviously, we've got a big focus on housing affordability and the housing crisis in Sydney at the moment. It is something that is affecting the entire country, but it is most acutely being felt in this city. And too often when we talk about housing affordability, we focus on purchase, homes to buy. But for an increasingly large proportion of the population, a third of Sydney siders are renters, and our data suggests that that's going to increase to over 50%. Quite quickly, and indeed within a generation, children born today, more than half of them are going to be lifetime renters. So where rental affordability goes, the success of our city goes in many respects, because the bulk of people will be experiencing renting for a very long time in their lives. So this is an important discussion to be had, and this research is the best that we've got. It's so fantastic because it really dives into giving a stark, clear, crisp understanding of exactly what's going on in this space. So we're going to hear from experts today about that issue, rental affordability. And I guess I want to acknowledge that online we've got a bunch of our colleagues, but we've also got some wonderful people who've been involved in the Rental Affordability Index over the last decade. Before we jump into that, acknowledging some supporters of the organisation and this event and our work. These are organisations on the screen that you can see that do amazing work and support the Committee for Sydney in all of our research agenda. These groups, our Innovation Fund partners and our Global Pathways partners, support our research agenda, and we're very grateful for their support. I also want to acknowledge our virtual hosts for today, Gilbert and Tobin. Obviously, we were intending to be in G&T's, Gilbert and Tobin's offices today. And it's not because of COVID that we're online, but because the trains are a bit skewy at the moment. And so we've had to jump online. So Gilbert and Tobin are our virtual hosts today, and we thank them for their support. And you check out their nice shiny new logo, which I understand is being launched today. With that in mind, you've heard enough from me. I'm going to hand over to experts. I'm going to hand over to Kishan and to Ellen, who are going to take us through some of the report insights. And then we're going to hand over to my colleague Estelle, who's going to lead a panel discussion with a whole bunch of really fantastic people, John, Trina, I think Tom, a few others. Yeah, with that, over to you guys. Thanks for coming along. Virtual.
Thanks, Eamon. So my name's Kishan, and just before I hand over to Ellen to take us through some of the results, I'm going to introduce the Rental Affordability Index, or I might call it the RAI occasionally for brevity, just so we understand how to interpret it, the background, and how we can use it as kind of decision makers, policy analysts, or just interested community members. So this is the 10th year that we're publishing the Rental Affordability Index, and it was created by SGS and National Shelter, but also had input from a range of industry experts. You can see there on the left at inception who helped form the methodology. Since then, it's gone through a lot of evolution. We've broadened the scope and looked at different household profiles and really improved the visual communication of the Rental Affordability Index. But throughout that time, it's maintained its focus on kind of three clear aims, and that is to understand the rental market specifically, as opposed to kind of the broader housing market, because as Eamon mentioned, renters are a large proportion of Australia's population. We want to consider, the Rental Affordability Index wants to consider not just the price of rents, but how that relates to the incomes that renters earn and whether that's a sustainable balance. And we also wanted to make it kind of a consistent and maintained evidence base, which can be used over time. And that's been really successful, having it released every year for the past 10 years and hopefully for many more. So I'm just going to explain what the Rental Affordability Index is quickly and how to interpret it before Ellen dives into the actual results. So as I mentioned, it's an index which considers both rents and incomes at the same time. So rent prices and incomes. And what you see on the right there is the different scores that the Rental Affordability Index reports. And essentially a score of 100 represents a household paying 30% of their income on rent. And lower scores are worse. So it means they're paying a higher proportion of their income at rent. And as we'll see soon, some low and very low income households would find themselves paying over 75% of their income if they tried to live in certain locations, especially in our capital cities. Well, just before I go to that, so in interpreting what the rise shows, the question doesn't really have a simple answer, the question of affordability. But there are two things that the Rental Affordability Index pulls out. So that is affordable where, which is why we see it as on the map. It's got quite a detailed spatial scale, and affordable for who. And so we consider 10 different household profiles, so we can assess affordability for these different types of households in different locations, as well as kind of the headline figure that you might see in the report, which is the average rental household. But some of the most stark results are for these very low income or low income households, ranging from, people like single pensioners or those on job seeker through to hospitality workers. And looking at it from these different angles can help formulate responses in terms of what housing assistance is needed, how much of it, where it should be, and how it can be delivered, which I'm sure we'll get into during the panel discussion. So I might hand over to Ellen now to take us through some of the results from the latest release.
Thank you so much, Kishan. And before we get into that, just want to acknowledge we have a special guest today as well, Adrian Pizarski, who was actually at the start of the development of the RAI and came up with the idea. And I think it's been great that we have been able to develop this idea to the strong index that it is today as something that can really track the rental market across all geographies, for all household types. So when we focus specifically on Greater Sydney, what has changed over the 10 years? I think initially what we can say around 2014, affordability was already quite a significant issue, even for the average income household. So all these orange areas and red areas you see here on the map is already where people were at the time struggling to pay rents. But what you see over time is that this affordability crisis sort of expands like an oil stain to an increasingly larger area. And again, this is just for the average income household. So that's an income of $123,000 per annum. So that's not nothing. Those are very decent wages, and still it's not getting people into any good situation in terms of affordability. So whenever people start paying 30% of their income or more on rent, they're unable to pay for other primary needs such as food, heating or cooling of the house, transport, education, medical needs. And if your washing machine then breaks down, these households are in trouble. And especially if we look further down to the lower income households. And also, just to set the record straight, renting households in Australia are now around a third of all households, and they're in the rental market for a long time and often forever. And in Greater Sydney, that's even higher. So here at this slide, you can see by income quintile, what's the percentage of people in the rental market. So not surprisingly, the lower two quintiles, that there's around over 40% of households renting, and then it goes down, but even the highest quintile, still a quarter of people are renting. So this is an increasingly large voter base, and we already see this is starting to really influence the political debate, and I actually hope so even more in the future, because this is now a real big problem for so many people. So if we look at the rental affordability over the years, it actually for quite a while, it was sort of slowly improving in Greater Sydney. And then, of course, COVID happened. That was a real big game changer for a bit, where affordability was quite high. Some households moved out to the regions, which created a lot of trouble there. But since we're now in a situation that's worse than where we started. So affordability in Greater Sydney is at an all-time low. And that's been decreasing quite substantially, especially over the last year. Rents increasing by around 9% just in a single year. And we've seen around in the different media that actually rent increases have now been a big contributor to inflation. So the cost of living crisis is actually made worse because of what's happening in the rental market. We see a similar picture for the regional areas where affordability started to decrease quite a bit earlier, and now is also at an all-time low for regional New South Wales. We know, especially in some of the key sea change locations, there, of course, the change has been more rapid than anywhere else. And we've got now some very unaffordable places up in the Northern Rivers area, for instance. But what I really want to show as well, some of these lived experience changes for the lower income households. So what you see here on the slide is the job seeker, and to paint that picture a bit more, last year when I presented the data, we had these dark red slides, and I was interested to find out, well, actually, there's a next layer to the conversation there, is we found that the rents are so high in some areas that it's 75% or more of people's income. So that just means entire cohorts of the population are basically set out of the game. They're not part of the game anymore. They're pushed out of the market. And sometimes in the past it was argued, well, if you can't pay the rents, maybe just move out a bit further. Well, where do we move? This is extremely unaffordable, and that's for various household types. Here, a single part-time working parent on benefits was already bad in 2014, 2024, there's really nowhere to go anymore. And if you then want to enable people to find jobs and to work and to get to work, we're actually in a situation that's no longer possible. And increasingly, businesses are requiring people to get back to the office. It's not possible for a lot of people. And then a single full-time working parent, even for them, it's not as drastic as you can see, but still we're talking about the rents well over 30%. and long travel times, and especially if you're a parent, you have to bring kids to school and pick them up from childcare, and then you need to travel a lot. It makes it very difficult to get through the day. So I mentioned before, there was, of course, some effect of COVID, and when a JobKeeper was introduced and the rents went down, there was actually a short period of time that people actually got a breather and that they just had a bit more to spend. But as you can see, even then, and for some people, I think their incomes were close to doubling, the situation was still one where rents are unaffordable. And in capital cities, there's been some interesting changes. And of course, you can see since COVID, it's all going downhill for most areas, except for Greater Hobart and the ACT. So we looked at, well, what's going on there? Hobart, what we saw there is that population growth was slowing down, the economy was slowing down. And they were coming from already a very dire situation, because it was only 2 years back that Hobart was the least affordable city to rent. So that was quite easy to explain. Then we looked at the ACT, like what's going on there? Population growing fine, the economy ticking along. But in 2019, the government there introduced rules around excessive rate increases. So they basically said to landlords, yes, you can increase your rents actually by 110% of inflation. So that's really quite reasonable, but not excessively so. So if you want to increase your rent much more, you actually need to make a case and actually demonstrate that maybe there is a change in the property and that the amenity of living has gone up significantly. And then, of course, you can charge more. But it has changed the dynamics and the negotiating powers between a tenant and a landlord. Tenants typically were afraid to negotiate rents because in a market where the vacancy rates are that low, you actually can't really negotiate because they can just find another tenant. So putting in place that sort of rules can actually make things quite different. And we're now seeing that that's the only state where rental affordability has actually improved. If we then combine it, because we now have a national housing crisis, with the fact that, for instance, Commonwealth rental assistance has been going up, so subsidies are going into a market where the supply side determines the price, because the vacancy rates are very low. All those subsidies basically go straight into rent increases. So they do not end up with the people that we want to help. And I'm quite happy to pay my taxes and help lower income households with that and make their situation more affordable. But I think a lot of taxpayers would not be happy to be subsidizing landlords necessarily, because they are just not in such a situation of dire need. So just a few more pictures to zoom in. So what has changed in terms of rental affordability? 2014 again, average income household. So this really everywhere around the city where all the jobs are. And we see that just getting darker over time. So there's, of course, an interactive map, and I think we've got in one of the last slides our link in there as well. So everyone, we encourage you to have a look at those slides and to look into that. Here again, some data on how the ACT is beating the trend. You can see all the averages going down, and just for Hobart and the ACT, rental affordability has gone up. And for Hobart, it's easily explained by population growth and the economy, but for the ACT, we actually saw that there must be another reason, and the key thing that changed in the ACT has been the introduction of preventing these excessive rent raises, so just putting some guide rails around that. So then, and I might end up here very shortly, is, if you wanted to look at different policy levers, we see social housing as essential infrastructure. So there's a real need to look at this now also at the national level. It's not just a problem of the state or of local individual councils anymore. We've got a national housing problem that's been building over quite a long time. So we need to think about social and affordable housing, having a national plan, also look at tax reform and collaboration between all layers of government, local, state, and national. But I'll just leave it at that for now. And hand over to Estelle, or do we want to catch a few questions that maybe were raised during the presentation?
Yeah, there's a few questions in there, but I think we can address them during the panel discussion.
Okay. Yep.
They're very much in line with what we're going to chat about, so we'll do that. Hello, I'm Estelle Gretsch. I lead planning and housing policy at the Committee for Sydney. I'm going to do a quick panel introduction, and then we'll get into a chat. Please, ask questions at any time, and we can sort of weave that into the conversation. So thank you so much to SGS for your presentation, and to our fellow panelists who are joining us today. We've got Tom Loomes, Executive Director of Strategy, Planning and Policy at New South Wales Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. Alison Holloway, CEO, Principal and Partner at SGS Economics and Planning, but I'm sure her team members will be chiming in as well, hopefully, who are sitting next to her. John Engeler, CEO of Shelter New South Wales, but really here today to bring a national perspective as Chair of National Shelter. And of course, last but not least at all, Trina Jones, the wonderful New South Wales Rental Commissioner. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. I might start with Trina, actually. A lot of the data is quite sobering. But you've been busy tackling some sort of big rental rights issues over the last, has it been a little bit over a year since you started? So things like the government's commitment for it's passed legislation, no grounds eviction, looking at how to tackle portable bonds or pets in apartments. Can you talk us through how all of these policy changes will make it a little less grim, or hopefully a lot less grim for renters in New South Wales?
Really, and just well done to all the report, the people who worked on the report. I've been involved in this for a number of years in Sydney, and it's such an important evidence base and tool for all of us working in this sector. So thank you. What I would say is rights in the rental market and ensuring that we have a viable rental market are critical to the whole health of the housing ecosystem. So when we think about affordability, looking at the rental market is really important, because we know that the lowest income people who are waiting for social housing are waiting in the rental market, and that's demonstrated so viscerally in the colours there that we've seen. I've seen you've added the colour purple to identify the really vulnerable people in our rental market right now. So when we're designing laws to make renting fairer, we're not only thinking about all renters, we're thinking about the most vulnerable renters in the market as well. And that's why these hard won and long fought for and advocated for changes around ending no grounds eviction are foundational and important changes for the rights of renters. And it really means that if the rental property is staying on the market, and the person is paying their rent and doing the right thing, they can stay in their rental home. And this reduces the anxiety and the fear and the stress of having to move rental homes lots of times. And we know that people are moving every 18 months. And when they do move, it costs them a lot of money, and it's very stressful. It's one of the most stressful things that you can do in your life is move home. And when I go out and speak to renters in community, they're letting me know that they're moving every year. Some of them have, kids in school, kids doing their HSC, leading up to exams, and having to move home all the time is a huge strain on people's ability to connect to their community. And so the government has a strong rental reform agenda. So we're focused on making renting fairer by making sure that the laws are fit for purpose. And some of those laws that have been introduced already, as you've said, we've just recently passed the bill in Parliament, but some of those are already in effect, like making sure that rent can't be increased more than once every 12 months. And this is really important signal to people as well, so they can plan and budget for the year ahead. And we've also released the rent check tool, which is the first time the government have used bond data to help consumers and property providers in the market understand market prices, because often we rely on listing data, but we know that what the property is listed as is not necessarily what it's leased as. So what we're trying to do as the regulator and working within fair trading is to make sure that people have access to information to help them to inform their decisions about their rental homes, but also that they've got the rights to ensure that they can stay in those rental homes and have knowledge and information about what's affordable for them. There's also the portable rental bond scheme, Stan. If I've got 5 minutes, I'll just talk about what that means. So this is a nation leading program. What that will mean is if you've got a bond in the system, you'll be able to transport that bond from the property that you're living in to the new property that you want to move into. And this will have no impact on landlords. This is an agreement between the government and the tenant. So it's business as usual for landlords and agents. But when the tenant is moving to their new property, they would pay the difference. If there's more to be paid, they pay the difference and then they transfer their bond. And should there be a claim on that bond, then the government will pay that claim and the tenant will pay us back. And all the details of that will be worked out as we release the programme in the second half of next year. But this will be a game changer for renters because it will enable them to have much more freedom in terms of cash flow when it comes time to move, and reduce that cost of living pressure for those in the rental market, who we know many of whom will be in the rental market forever.
Thanks, Trina. Tom, I'm going to throw to you. Obviously, you're playing, and DeFi is playing a big role in addressing the housing crisis through unlocking new supply. But I kind of want to zoom into something that, like, we at the community think is really important and quite extraordinary around the sort of TODSEP and how it's sort of the first time that we're seeing DeFi bring in inclusionary zoning at some sort of scale. Could you kind of talk us through why this is a good thing for renters, and how you can see it playing out through TODs, also the changes to the housing set where you get 30% bonus for 15% affordable housing in perpetuity?
Sure. Thanks, Estelle. So yeah, the inclusionary zoning part of the TODs is really just one part of our broader response to the housing crisis, of which, what we've seen today is the rental affordability crisis is a really critical aspect of that. Our response to the housing crisis, and continues on this week, has been pretty widely criticised as being a very broad policy response. But I think what we've just seen from those statistics is that the crisis is broad. It is not one single isolated part of the city or even the state. It is very far reaching. And so that obviously requires quite a broad policy response. So, what do we know is that roughly 30% of households are in the private rental market, and only a very, very tiny fraction of those, around 5%, are social housing, and an even smaller fraction is affordable housing. That is quite a challenge when you look at other global cities who have a much higher proportion, sometimes 4, 5, 6 times the amount of social and affordable housing when compared with Sydney. That was the sort of thinking that went into how we approached our housing supply policy response. So we know that we need a greater supply of both private rental, but also we need to boost the diversity of homes as well. Part of those stresses, the drivers for the rental affordability crisis, is that people want to live in locations that they love and have come to know and are being squeezed out by prices, but they also want the type of home that matches their lifestyle. We are quickly becoming a tale of two cities, the detached dwelling and the high-rise apartment. We need to see more of that diversity. And so you see all of this involved in our response. So to take you to the TODSEP, it does have a 2% inclusionary zoning aspect. It's something I'm very proud of. I don't think that as a government, we've had a lot of success in the past in doing sort of widespread affordable housing components. We've done, inclusionary zoning aspects, in particular uplift areas and precincts, but this is really taking a much broader response. You will see more of that to come before the end of the year with the finalisation of our accelerated TOD precincts, really continuing that commitment to that affordable housing supply side. I think the thing that I am probably most proud of, though, is the low and mid-rise response. Really, this is an enormous diversity push, but it's also a massive supply push. Anyone who's paid attention to it over the last year since we first exhibited really understands that we need to fill those market gaps for people who want to live in different types of homes in the areas that they love. It's also a commitment that we need to see supply in all local government areas across New South Wales. It cannot happen in just the Western Sydney local government areas. It can't just happen in the middle ring areas. It's got to happen in the east as well. It's really debilitating, I think, on a daily basis, and I'm sure John will attest to this, to see local government areas in the east, particularly in the North Shore, who are saying we don't want more social housing in our area. They are places that don't have a great deal of social housing. We have to be able to boost that. We have to be able to take ourselves from a city of great unaffordability, a lack of diversity, and a lack of equity to really reinstill that into our housing market. And it's not going to happen in 5 years, but we need it to happen in 20, so the next generation are not locked out of both the rental market, but also the housing market generally, both here and more broadly across the state.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I hope maybe as low and mid-rise is finalised, we see some form of affordable housing inclusionary zoning in that too, like the Todd set, but we'll see. John, I'm going to throw to you, sort of Tom's spoken through the New South Wales government's response. What's the call to action for the federal government? Like, what would you like to see the Commonwealth do to sort of help aid this as well?
Thanks very much for the opportunity, and thank you. You have echoed what I was going to say to Tom, so that's good about the possibility of some contribution there in the low to mid-rise when it comes to specific affordable housing. Look, I think what we'd say about the Commonwealth, there's a couple of ways they can do things. They can show leadership. So I think often we're thinking about this as being an urgent response. We often think about the Commonwealth's response to housing as being something that happens after the war or after the global financial crisis or to do with COVID. We've had previous governments in the past. At one stage, the Deputy Prime Minister, Brian Howe, was also Minister for basically better cities. So the Commonwealth can lead, show leadership in this space. And not just to do with the urgent thing about housing affordability. One of the things that we sometimes worry about is that if we just restrict the discussion to affordability, sometimes affordability comes at the expense of amenities. So we often say it's all the A's, especially for people on low and very low incomes, accessible, affordable, with good amenity, and ultimately with agency in terms of people feeling like it's their home for a long period, especially as renters. So a couple of things. The Commonwealth can show leadership with think tanks, ideas, really understanding that they shouldn't just come in when it's urgent or too late or a crisis. So that's one. Secondly, the tax levers. And in fact, some of these levers are indeed buttons. They could be buttons that could be pushed tomorrow. They don't have to be long-term supply issues. So it is time that we as a nation had the conversation about the number of tax things that work almost sometimes against each other. So there's various people who would talk about the extent to which negative gearing, capital gains, Commonwealth rental assistance, or even discounted rent for withholding tax on the build-to-rent product. So it's time that we had that discussion and that housing was seen from that point of view as essential infrastructure, not just a welfare issue, particularly for low-income people. Essential infrastructure, in fact, the most essential infrastructure, some would argue. So leadership, looking at the tax settings, whether they're removed, reformed, certainly reviewed at the very least. I think it's time for that. I think it is shaping up to be an election issue. But all of those things are things that the Commonwealth could possibly, in terms of regulatory reform or levers or buttons that could be pushed, that could be now. Finally, I think few people disagree now on any hue of the political spectrum about the need of the Housing Australia Future Fund. A specific amount of money quarantined outside of the political cycle that's expressly for generating income that can pay for social and affordable housing. So we would argue that that amount, currently 10 billion, could be quadrupled. It would make a massive difference. I'll go so far. It's the week to talk about this. We've seen a number of our peers put out reports from CoreLogic to Ahuri. Kate Colvin had some work out around homelessness Australia this week to do with from Impact Economics, highly regarded as well. One of the peers, Dr. Angela Jackson. I think it's okay that we're allowed to have the conversation that if we have to introduce a new colour in Ellen and SGS's work to talk about the critical unaffordability. It's time we had that very big discussion about, is the future fund itself in Australia over 200 billion from memory? It's time. There's been some mutterings this week to say, can't that, at least in part, be directed towards housing? It's about time that we looked at that. So I think that's what we'd say as the big ticket items. The Commonwealth has an opportunity here to really lean in.
Thanks, John. Alison, the sort of question that I had for you was around, we've been producing this for 10 years now. It's great longitudinal data. The tool is also very interactive as well. Like, you can put your own income and see where is affordable or not affordable for you, or you can empathise with different household types or occupations. I'm going to try to weave in some of Leo's questions as well while we're having this conversation. So I think, we're representing data. It's a map. You're using the data that you have. Leo's first one was around one of the challenges that cities aren't like for like. So Greater Sydney is a much bigger city than, like, for example, Canberra or Hobart. You might have to live 100 kilometres away from the CBD compared to 20 kilometres away in the smaller cities. What lessons have you learned over the 10 years about communicating, I guess, both rental affordability more general, but also like when you're comparing different cities and relative incomes and those sorts of things?
Thanks, Estelle. It's been such a rich discussion so far around both understanding the situation for rental affordability and what it means for what's next. I think what we've learned over the 10 years of the time series is that the experience of rental affordability is different in different locations and for different households. And this evidence base over time provides a prompt for us to delve into deeper about the solutions to ensure that the solutions are tailored to those different locations and those different household types. When we think about the data at a national, even state or city scale, it still hides the experience for a lot of households. So I think the power of delving in and having a little play around the maps really helps to bring that lived experience story together. I'll just say as well, there's a lot of conversation that we're in a housing crisis. And when we think about what a crisis is, it tends to be time limited, and it tends to be something that's a disruption of normal functioning. But what we've seen with this data over 10 years is that we saw this coming. We have been having this conversation both about rental affordability and broader housing affordability for a long time. So it's not something, a quick intervention to affect a crisis. We're talking about something that's a predicament that needs a deep structural change and a shift in the way that we're thinking about it. The conversation today has been around social and affordable housing. It's been about home ownership. It's been about diversity of household types and a diversity of new housing supply and different locations. But I think we also need to think about moving beyond, 3 types of housing tenure, beyond social and affordable housing, rental housing and home ownership. We need all of the solutions. So, there are models that tap into the role of housing as essential infrastructure, targeted at essential workers, looking at shared equity, for example, that provides a more accessible option for home ownership. There's some terrific leadership from Police Bank and Hope Housing that are providing shared equity options for police force, Police Bank members. That's having a big impact on police officers' ability to live closer to work. It has a big impact on commute times, which means that police officers, when on duty, are on duty, and we need that. And we know that there's large turnover in inner city locations of essential workers, and that impacts the whole city. There are also housing tenure options. I think we need to have more of a conversation around cooperative housing and co-housing options that open up different tenure options that provide rent like you own options and address the housing security challenges that Trina talked about. We know that's a big impact on household wellbeing, that lack of uncertainty about the future and being able to plan ahead. and cooperative housing options provide that long tenure and security of tenure in a more affordable model as well. So I think, you know, as well as supply options, we need to look at the governance and ownership models that provide, you know, solutions across this, because we need to have a go at everything at this point.
I'm going to sort of try to weave in another one of Leo's questions. He raised, you know, WA's refused to move towards rental reform. The index is showing that it's one of the most unaffordable cities. I'm going to also bring in ACT, which has sort of managed to buck the trend a little bit. And obviously, they've brought in legislation on sort of rental stabilization. You can't increase more than 110%. So I might kind of throw maybe to the team SGS first to talk through ACT trends, but maybe perhaps Trina, if you're open to sharing some of the experience working through no grounds with the community, I guess, how do you sort of tackle that sort of, it's going to impact rental supply question as we sort of move towards rental reforms that, like, you know, over a third of people really desperately need? Maybe, yeah, so team SGS, then Trina, and then John or Tom, if you want to jump in as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I looked at some of those questions. I think one thing I just want to clarify there is that the rise of price index, so it looks at what the typical rents are in an area relative to what the typical income is in the greater urban area. So even if higher income households move to another area, that won't change the index because it's a price index. So that addresses a few of those questions I just quickly saw popping up there. And I think the other question was really around the ACT. I think, yeah, the key thing there, and that was also in the slides, is that, you know, if you can prevent rents rising much faster or not faster than incomes, then you can already make a really big change in a short period of time. And it's really great that we've got now this long and rich data set over different years and different jurisdictions, because now we can actually see sort of what happens if you put in place certain regulations. And especially important, I think it has shown that the rental market hasn't collapsed in the ACT. You know, there's always a lot of scaremongering in the debates, like, oh, if you do something that may change the situation for investors, then the whole market is going to collapse. And I think if you put in place very reasonable measures where you just say we don't want excessive rent increases, which I think is a very reasonable requirement, then you can already start to change the landscape quite easily. And it's something you can introduce. It doesn't cost the taxpayers any money, and it does make the situation fairer for everyone. So we're just really keen to keep on tracking the data for the ACT and see what some of these changes are. And hopefully some other jurisdictions will follow so that we can start following that. And same with, you know, the no-fault evictions that may start to actually show up in the data as well at some point.
Trina, did you have any reflections to add?
Look, there's probably two reflections on this one. From the perspective of jurisdictional analysis around the impact of no grounds eviction, this is something I try to talk about as much as I can. So analysis of all Australian rental markets find that there's been no statistically significant difference in the main kind of metrics around the rental market health for those that have introduced no grounds eviction. So what that means is they haven't disproportionately been impacted in terms of the investment or the retention of their rental supply. Now, when we start to think about the health of the market, there's lots of metrics that we look at, but some of the key metrics, particularly as it relates to regulation, that we would look at are things like investor lending, vacancy rates, you know, median rent, bonds held, and that kind of gives us an oversight of what would the impact be to the market, if any. Now, when we start to look at the jurisdictions that have introduced no grounds eviction, they've seen a substantial increase in investor lending as a proportion of total lending. So we know that that's been between 18% and 46% increase. And with the exception of Melbourne and all capital cities that have introduced no grounds eviction, actually seen minor improvements to the vacancy rates since their reforms were introduced. And I think it's also a question about what does success look like, because while Victoria is having some issues in terms of their rental supply, they've also seen a significant increase in first-time home buyers in their rental market. So if you're taking a whole perspective on the housing market, and we know renters want to be homeowners, the recent report from Holloway found that 80% of renters that were surveyed wanted to be homeowners, but less than 50% actually thought they could be. So it's really interesting, you know, to hear some of the ideas on the panel and things that I support as well, which is around a diverse rental market. So what does that look like for people who need support in the rental market? So that kind of goes to my second part of the question, and that is, what's a healthy market? Well, a healthy market is a diverse market. And a big part of responding to the affordability challenges is investment in social housing. Affordable housing is a critical part, but social housing is the heavy hitter, particularly in the rental market, because we know from the evidence, and it's not often talked about that much, but I really want to get the message out that investment in social housing delivers affordability in the private rental market. And this is demonstrated not only here in Australia, but in New Zealand and other parts of the world. So when we get a boost in supply in social housing, we see more consistency of price increases in the private rental market. And that means more predictable affordability for all. Now, when it comes to choice, or as John really succinctly and well put it, agency for renters, diversity of supply also offers that for them. So build to rent, purpose-built student accommodation, rent to buy, cooperative housing, all of these are important parts of the puzzle. And we've all said this, but we do need to let 1,000 flowers bloom. We need to have lots of different ways to increase the supply of housing in our community. It's not one type of supply that will respond to the affordability crisis. It's diverse supply, meeting the needs of community where they are, close to transport links, which is why the TODs are a game changer. And it's so critical that all of the supply will be mixed tenure developments, important to include affordable, social, and some of those, market offerings for the likes of key workers or students who really need them in the places they want to live. So there's a lot of work for us to do, but the good thing is there's a lot of work underway. New South Wales have a strong change agenda for this. Some of the big changes have already landed, and as Tom said, there's more to come. So I really think that we will see this start to improve, but it will take all strength to arms.
I know Don or Tom, if you want to jump in, but otherwise we'll go to a question from Emily.
Can I just quickly jump in? No, absolutely. Just to really reiterate again. So what's one really important part of the puzzle, which we all increasingly agree on, is the need for the safety net of social housing. So just looking at the ACT, double the national average, closer to 7%. And that's coming off what was an even higher figure previously. So at the end of the day, one thing that this research definitely shows us, for low-income people, retirement is no place for renters. Retirement's no place for renters. So we do need that safety net of public housing. The ACT has 7%. Other places should be able to have that. It clearly helps to make sure that affordability is not experienced as badly as it would otherwise be.
I agree. And I'd just say as well, important part of this puzzle, and we haven't spoken about it too much, and I think there was a question from Helen there, is build to rent is an important part of the diverse supply model. And while if we want to talk about OG build to rent, affordable housing is the original build to rent, social housing is the original build to rent. But if you start to think about the spectrum, what build to rent offers is indefinite leases, and they also offer controlled rent increases over time. So if you sign up for a 3-year lease with some of the build to rent providers, they'll tell you what the increases will be, very similar to commercial leases. Now, we're encouraging that sector to do that for a 5-year, a 10-year outlook. And that is more of a safety net for the retiree who can maybe downsize to a predictable build to rent environment where they can get a sense of community, their amenity can be measured, and they can have an outlook of what they can actually afford to live in. So we really want to see that tenure type blossom in New South Wales as well. And I think there's some things that we need to do there to work closely with industry to make sure that it's regulated well and that they continue to provide predictability and certainty for the people who live there. Because obviously, as John said, retirement and renting don't mix well without very clear guardrails.
On the sort of theme of diversity is key, the question from Emily is it possible to understand if the RAI has been dampened in outer suburbs as relatively high income households move out to these suburbs to live in more relatively affordable housing? Might throw to you, Ellen. I think you had some charts.
I think I already addressed that question because it's a price index. So we're not actually measuring for each household what they are paying on rent. It's actually what are the income levels, what are the rents in the different suburbs, and we measure it that way. So people moving from one suburb to the other doesn't really impact the affordability.
I might add something to that. So if in reality people had moved out of suburbs and that had pushed prices up, what it might show is that those look more unaffordable now because average rents have increased there. So for the typical household, these places now look less affordable, or for lower income households who would have previously wanted to live there because they were affordable, the migration of higher income households, which then tightens the rental market there, make these other suburbs less affordable.
Yeah, totally. I think that's what I was thinking too. And I sort of, back to the point of diversity, like having a whole range of housing options for diverse households in different areas are going to sort of help aid that. And of course, going back to the idea that social housing is really critically important. Which question will I go to now? They're quite long. It takes me a while to read them properly. I'll go to one from Helen. Bit controversial. Do you think the term essential or key worker housing is helpful or not?
I think there's also a question there on build to rent that Tom maybe want to talk to.
True. But yeah, I might maybe throw to you, John. Do you have thoughts on essential key worker housing, and we can flesh out BTR a little bit more?
I do. Just really quickly, once upon a time when we had social housing and it was doing its job, we really didn't need to have this discussion. Pardon me. Unfortunately, what we've now seen to have happen is people who would otherwise have had rent that was affordable, and the research shows this for the 10 years, and sometimes we can talk about heroic essential workers like AMBOs, police and teachers. Really, we're talking about the cleaners, the checkout operators and the carers that kept everyone fed, safe and watered during COVID. These are people who are essential to the extent to which they are now have industries in certain parts of, say, the northern beaches of Sydney, or as Tom's mentioned, in the eastern suburbs, where it's difficult for you to be compliant with your aged care requirements for care hours or the numbers of carers in childcare. To that extent, they are essential. They are often working out of hours, shift work, travelling great distances for modest wages, and often on their feet all day. There's an old adage, which is probably appropriate to use here. COVID taught us this. If you're not someone who can ring up and say, I think I'll work from home today, or even participate in something like this, you are essential. And I think what's happening is, and the reason why it is important to differentiate, the Commissioner's already talked about the difference between social housing and other types, affordable housing, capital A affordable housing. We need it. We are now starting to see, and I know the committee's done some great work about the lost productivity that happens in cities when you don't have the workers and you're losing them to other regions or cities or states. That's where it is an essential issue. So just to finish, I do think it's important. I think we've probably wound it back a bit, and the great work that SGS has done over the years showing us the relationship between income and rents. No one should be paying more than 30% of their income in rent. That's a universal maxim that we need to always go to. So to that extent, we should never supplant that, but there's obviously going to be people who are not in social housing necessarily, not on a statutory income, but on such modest and low wages, doing essential work. I think our housing system needs to reflect their needs better.
I don't know, Tom, if you have any thoughts on this, and I know sort of the housing minister's guidelines are under review, so not sure how much you can say, but anything to add to John's points?
I probably have my personal view about the planning system is that it's constantly criticised for being too complex. Read the paper every day, and that if the planning system starts to delve too heavily into who is occupying the home, it becomes more complex, because then it becomes about the who and not the what. And my view is that an affordable housing dwelling should look the same as a private market dwelling. It should have the same finishes, the same amenity, as obviously should social housing as well, but that is obviously largely delivered by the state, so we can have some role in that. So my view on some of the things that have been raised personally today about looking at different tenancy arrangements and I think looking at different management practices and then how they would insert themselves into the planning system is, I think we've got to get back to a planning system that's simpler, that provides more certainty and consistency overall, so that we can, as Trina said, let 1,000 blossoms bloom. I guess, what do we know that works though? We know that certainty in a system works. So giving people upfront certainty about what a affordable housing component could be helps land values adjust. It allows feasibility to set itself in stone, and then obviously that will become more and more feasible over time. Consistency is a critical issue that faces the planning system, with over 120 council areas in the state. The rules area to area have said, that you might have certain things approvable or permissible here, but not, across the road in a different LGA. But we also need that for our policies in terms of affordable housing and social housing and where those quotas should go. But the final thing that we know, and the developers in the room will love this, is that incentives work. So we introduced an affordable housing bonus scheme at the end of last year, with an expectation that we'll see probably around 25 projects in our first year. We've trebled that number, and we're not even 1 year out since we started. We have more than 75 projects before us, 4,000 affordable housing potential dwellings that are sitting, through that project scheme itself. So my focus is really on that consistency, that certainty, that simplicity, but also making sure that we're getting the incentives right to deliver. Otherwise, what's it all for?
I think, Estelle, you're absolutely right, Tom. Like it's the housing supply is part of the solution, but we can't overload it with everything, and we need other parts of the economy and how the housing system works to be part of the conversation. So I don't think it's about loading extra things onto the planning system, but broadening out to say supply is one aspect, but it's not going to give us the full solution that we need. That we need all the other things on the go as well, and seeing them as complementary.
Which sort of interesting question from Anjali. It sounds like rent is a contributor to inflation. Does it make sense to limit or tie rent increases to inflation, or is there another way? And I know, Ellen, you were talking about kind of recent commentary from the RBA around how rent is actually driving inflation, which results in this sort of wicked cycle of, rent interest rates not coming down and that driving up rent and, all that sort of economics.
We'll add to
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Sorry, go on, Trina. Yeah.
I was just going to say, though, I will say that there's some interesting things happening in the market in terms of what consumers are willing to pay as well. And we're seeing some interesting trends from analysis that we've done over the last 10 years, where renters are saying, actually, we won't pay that advertised price, we'll pay less. It's not drastically less. I won't say it's going to shift the needle in terms of the increases that we've seen, but it is interesting that we're seeing that in quite a number of cases, and they're successful in that. So that sort of indicates to us, at least initially, that the market has reached its peak in some areas. I will say the behavior of renters is changing as a result, though, and what we saw through COVID is lots of people move out of share houses and move into single household dwellings or coupled household dwellings. And now we're seeing lots of people move into bigger houses in the fringes of Greater Sydney in share house kind of group dynamics and group household formations, and less interest in apartments that are more expensive because people just can't afford them at the size and scale of them. So I know there was an earlier question about, are people moving out to outer areas as families into homes? It's not just families, and we know 51% of renters are families with dependent children of different groupings of families, but we're actually seeing a lot of couples in their 30s and couples in their late 20s who don't have kids, and some who do, move into share house arrangements in the outer suburbs. And that's adding, as you've said already, a lot of stress to people in terms of their commute time and a lot of issues. But again, it's about cost of living and people being able to get their costs down. And I know there was a comment as well in the questions about, is it that people actually want to own their home, or is it that they just want to have indefinite leases and long-term security? And I would think it's the latter. I think that people are would be flexible about the tenure type if they could have the choice and control over the type of housing they could live in and over the time that they could live there for. And so I think that as policymakers, we have some thinking to do together to say, well, do we want to shift to a really strong, viable rental market that's a genuine choice of tenure? Or do we want to patchwork along to try to get more people into home ownership? Like, what is the policy decision? And what do the community want and need?
Yep.
Any last reflections from anyone before we wrap? No? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us online and for pivoting. Thanks again to our panelists, and really encourage you to jump onto the website now and check out the interactive rental affordability index. But yeah, I think that's all for now. Yep, there's a link. Perfect.
Right. Thanks, Estelle. Thanks.
Thanks, Estelle.
Thanks
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a great
Thank you.
weekend.
Thank you, Estelle.
Bye.
Thanks to you guys, the
Everybody.
committee. Thank you.